Question 5. Were the Indian Wars a triumph or a tragedy? Our goals. We'll learn about the last violent conflicts between whites and independent Native American groups. We'll understand the motivations of white settlers, the government, and Native Americans that led to conflict in the West. We'll consider events and developments such as the Sioux Wars, destruction of the buffalo, creation of reservations, the Ghost Dance movement, the Dawes Act and Americanization. Our big idea. The last violent conflicts between whites and independent Native Americans were in the late 1800s on the Great Plains. Ultimately, the Army defeated the last of the tribes and forced them to move to reservations, where official government policy attempted to destroy Native culture. Let's get started with our introduction. Just as they had done east of the Mississippi River, when white settlers pushed westward, they came into conflict with Native American tribes. Although the threat of attacks was quite slim and nowhere proportionate to the number of army actions directed against them, the occasional attack, often one of retaliation, was enough to fuel the popular fear of savage Indians. The clashes, when they happened, were indeed brutal, although most of the brutality occurred at the hands of the settlers. Ultimately, the settlers, with the support of local militias and later with the federal government behind them, sought to remove the tribes from lands the West desired. The result was devastating for the Native American tribes who lacked weapons and group cohesion to fight back against well-armed forces. Modern Americans celebrate the nation as a land stretching from sea to shining sea, but that expansion came at a cost. The final conflict between the government and the Sioux nations of the Northern Plains did indeed open the entire West to white settlement, but marked the absolute destruction of traditional Native American culture. Was this episode in America's Westward March a triumph or a tragedy? What do you think?
Removal by treaty. Back east, the popular vision of the West was of a vast and empty land. Of course, this was an exaggerated depiction. On the eve of westward expansion, as many as 250,000 Native Americans, representing a variety of tribes, populated the Great Plains. Previous wars against these tribes in the early 19th century, as well as the failure of earlier treaties, had led to a general policy of the forcible removal of many tribes in the eastern United States. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 resulted in the infamous Trail of Tears, which saw nearly 50,000 Seminole, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek Indians relocated west of the Mississippi River to what is now Oklahoma between 1831 and 1838. Building upon such a history, the government was prepared during the rest of the century to deal with tribes that settlers viewed as obstacles to expansion. As settlers sought more land for farming, mining, and cattle ranching, the first strategy employed to deal with a perceived threat from resident Native Americans was to negotiate settlements to move tribes out of the path of white settlers onto designated lands called reservations. In 1851, the chiefs of most of the Great Plains tribes agreed to the first Treaty of Fort Laramie, which did just that. This agreement established distinct tribal borders, essentially codifying the reservation system, in return for annual payments of $50,000 to the tribes, originally guaranteed for 50 years, but later revised to last for only 10, as well as the hollow promise of non-interference from westward settlers. Native Americans agreed to stay clear of the path of settlement. Due to government corruption, many annuity payments never reached the tribes, and some who moved to the reservations were left destitute and near starving. In addition, within a decade, as the pace and number of Western settlers increased, even designated reservations became prime locations for farming and mining. Rather than negotiating new treaties, settlers, oftentimes backed by local or state militia units, simply attacked the tribes out of fear or to force them from the land. Some Native American groups resisted, only to then face massacres. The Sioux Wars. In 1862, frustrated and angered by the lack of annuity payments and the continuous encroachment on their reservation lands, Sioux in Minnesota rebelled in what became known as the Dakota War, killing the white settlers who moved onto their tribal lands. Over 1,000 white settlers were captured or killed in the attack before an armed militia regained control. Of the 400 Sioux captured by government troops, 303 were sentenced to death, but President Lincoln intervened, releasing all but 38 of the men. The 38 who were found guilty were hanged in the largest mass execution in the country's history, and the rest of the tribe was banished. Settlers in other regions responded to news of this raid with fear and aggression. In Colorado, Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes fought back against land encroachment. White militias then formed, decimating even some of the tribes that were willing to cooperate. One of the more vicious examples was near Sand Creek, Colorado, where Colonel John Chivington led a militia raid upon a camp in which the leader had already negotiated a peaceful settlement. The camp was flying both the American flag and the white flag of surrender when Chivington's troops murdered close to 100 people, the majority of them women and children, in what became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. For the rest of his life, Chivington would proudly display his collection of nearly 100 scalps from that day. Subsequent investigations by the Army condemned Chivington's tactics and their results. However, the raid served as a model for some settlers who sought any means by which to eradicate the perceived threat from their Native American neighbors. Hoping to forestall similar uprisings and all-out Indian wars, Congress commissioned a committee to investigate the causes of such incidents. The subsequent report of their findings led to the passage of 2 additional treaties, the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie and the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek, both designed to move the remaining tribes to even more remote reservations. The Second Treaty of Fort Laramie moved the remaining Sioux to the Black Hills in the Dakota Territory, and the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek moved the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Comanche to Indian Territory, later to become the state of Oklahoma. The agreements were short-lived, however. With the subsequent discovery of gold in the Black Hills, settlers seeking their fortune began to move upon the newly granted Sioux lands with support from federal cavalry troops. By the middle of 1875, thousands of white prospectors were illegally digging and panning in the area. The Sioux protested the invasion of their territory and the violation of sacred ground. The government offered to lease the Black Hills or to pay $6 million if the Sioux were willing to sell the land. When the tribes refused, the government imposed what it considered a fair price for the land, ordered the natives to move, and in the spring of 1876 made ready to force them onto the reservation. In the Battle of Little Bighorn, perhaps the most famous battle of the American West, Sioux chiefs Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse urged neighboring tribes to join in defense of their lands. At the Little Bighorn River, the Army's 7th Cavalry, led by Colonel George Custer, sought a showdown. Driven by his own personal ambition, on June 25, 1876, Custer foolishly attacked what he thought was a minor native encampment. Instead, it turned out to be the main Sioux force. The Sioux warriors, nearly 3,000 in strength, surrounded and killed Custer and 262 of his men and support units in the single greatest loss of government troops to a Native American attack in the era of westward expansion. The buffalo. The modern American bison, or buffalo as it is more commonly known, was a one-stop shop for the Plains tribes. Before the introduction of horses as part of the Columbian Exchange, bison were herded into large chutes made of rocks and willow branches and trapped in a corral called a buffalo pound, and then slaughtered or stampeded over cliffs called buffalo jumps. Both pound and jump archaeological sites are found in several places in the United States and Canada. In the case of a jump, large groups of people would herd the bison for several miles, forcing them into a stampede that drove the herd over a cliff. Horses taken from the Spanish were well established in the nomadic hunting cultures by the early 1700s, and indigenous groups once living east of the Great Plains moved west to hunt the larger bison population. There, during the 1600s and 1700s, extensive intertribal warfare was waged over access to hunting grounds, opened for the first time because of the access to horses. For the government and white settlers alike, destruction of the great bison herds of the plains was equivalent to the destruction of the Plains tribes, and the second half of the 1800s saw the near complete extinction of the species. For the settlers of the Plains region, bison hunting served as a way to increase their economic stake in the area. Trappers and traders made their living selling buffalo fur. In the winter of 1872 to 1873, more than 1.5 million buffalo were put onto trains and moved eastward. In addition to the potential profits from buffalo leather, which was commonly used to make machinery belts and army boots, buffalo hunting forced natives to become dependent on beef from cattle. General Winfield Scott Hancock, for example, reminded several Arapaho chiefs at Fort Dodge in 1867, "You know well that the game is getting very scarce, and that you must soon have some other means of living. You should therefore cultivate the friendship of the white man, so that when game is all gone, they may take care of you if necessary." Commercial bison hunters also emerged at this time. Military forts supported hunters who would use their civilian sources near their military base. Although officers hunted bison for food and sport, professional hunters made a far larger impact in the decline of bison population. Officers stationed in Fort Hays and Wallace even had bets in their buffalo shooting championship of the world between Medicine Bill Comstock and Buffalo Bill Cody. Some of these hunters would engage in mass bison slaughter in order to make a living. The Army sanctioned and actively endorsed the wholesale slaughter of bison herds. The federal government promoted bison hunting to allow ranchers to range their cattle without competition and primarily to weaken the Native American population. Without the bison, the people of the plains had no choice but to leave the land or starve to death. One of the biggest advocates of this strategy was General William Tecumseh Sherman. On June 26, 1869, the Army-Navy Journal reported that, quote, "General Sherman remarked in conversation the other day that the quickest way to compel the Indians to settle down to civilized life was to send 10 regiments of soldiers to the plains with orders to shoot buffaloes until they became too scarce to support the redskins." Unquote. As railroads expanded, military troops and supplies were able to be transported more efficiently to the Great Plains. Some railroads hired commercial hunters to feed their laborers. Buffalo Bill Cody, for example, was hired by the Kansas Pacific Railroad for this reason. Hunters began arriving in masses, and trains would slow down so men could climb aboard the roofs of trains or fire shots at herds from outside their windows. As a description of such a hunt from Harper's Weekly noted, quote, "The train is slowed to a rate of speed about equal to that of the herd. The passengers get out firearms which are provided for the defense of the train against the Indians, and open from the windows and platforms of the cars a fire that resembles a brisk skirmish." Unquote. The railroad industry also wanted bison herds culled or eliminated. Herds of bison on tracks could damage locomotives when the trains failed to stop in time, and encounters with bison herds could delay a train for days. The destruction of bison signaled the end of the Indian Wars and consequently their movement towards reservations where, having no knowledge of agriculture, they became dependent on government rations as source of food. The last Native American bison hunt was in 1882. When the Texas legislature proposed a bill to protect the bison, General Sheridan disapproved of it, stating, quote, "These men have done more in the last 2 years and will do more in the next year to settle the vexed Indian question than the entire regular army has done in the last 40 years. They are destroying the Indians' commissary, and it is a well-known fact that an army losing its base of supplies is placed at a great disadvantage. Send them power and lead, if you will, but for a lasting peace, let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffaloes are exterminated. Then your prairies can be covered with speckled cattle." Unquote. The mass buffalo slaughter had an ecological impact as well. Unlike cattle, bison were naturally fit to thrive in the Great Plains environment. The bison's giant herds are naturally fit to drive through snow and make them far more likely to survive harsh winters. Additionally, bison grazing helps to cultivate the prairie, making it ripe for hosting a diverse range of plants. Cattle, on the other hand, eat through vegetation and limit the ecosystem's ability to support a diverse range of species. Agriculture and residential development of the prairie is estimated to have reduced the prairie to 0.1% of its former area. The Plains region has lost nearly 1/3 of its prime topsoil since the onset of the buffalo slaughter. Cattle are also causing water to be pillaged at rates that are depleting many aquifers of their resources. Research now suggests that the absence of native grasses leads to topsoil erosion, which was a main contributor of the Dust Bowl and black blizzards of the 1930s. Although their strategy of destroying the bison to force Native Americans onto reservations worked to the whites' advantage, it would have been better for them in the end to adapt to the ways of their Native American neighbors and raise bison instead of cattle. Ultimately, bison were hunted down to roughly 300 individuals before a few ranchers and zoos began working to preserve the species. Today, about 500,000 bison currently exist on private lands and around 30,000 on public lands. Approximately 15,000 bison are considered wild, free-range bison, not primarily confined by fencing. Bison is the national mammal, a symbol of the many sides of America and its complicated history. The last of the free tribes. Despite their success at Little Bighorn, neither the Sioux nor any other Plains tribe followed this battle with any other armed encounter, perhaps due to the loss of bison or due to fear of returning troops. Most accepted payment for forcible removal from their lands. Sitting Bull himself fled to Canada, although he later returned in 1881 and subsequently worked in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. By the end of the 1880s, a general consensus seemed to have been reached among many politicians in Washington that the assimilation of Native Americans into American culture was preferable to slaughter on the battlefield, and that it was the time for them to leave behind their tribal landholding, reservations, traditions, and ultimately their identities. On February 8, 1887, the Dawes Act was signed into law by President Grover Cleveland in pursuit of these goals. The Dawes Act divided tribal reservations into plots of land for individual households, which white reformers had hoped would break up tribes as social units, encourage individualism, help convert nomadic natives into farmers, reducing the cost of administering reservations, and open the remainder of the West to white settlers. Eligible Native Americans had 4 years to select their land, but the lands set aside for reservations were not good for farming. In most cases, agreeing to the terms of the Dawes Act was tantamount to agreeing to live off government handouts forever, since the land would never support even a meager living, and so resistance to the reservation policy continued. In Montana, the Blackfoot and Crow were forced to leave their tribal lands. In Colorado, the Utes gave up their lands after a brief period of resistance. In Idaho, most of the Nez Perce gave up their lands peacefully, although in an incredible episode, a band of some 800 Nez Perce sought to evade government troops and escape into Canada. Chief Joseph, known to his people as Thunder traveling to the loftier mountain heights, hoped to lead the retreat of his people over 1,500 miles of mountains and harsh terrain, only to be caught within 50 miles of the Canadian border in late 1877. His speech has remained a poignant and vivid reminder of what the tribe had lost. Quote, "Tell General Howard I know his heart. What he told me before, I have it in my heart. I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. Tahuihuilshut is dead. The old men are all dead. It is the young men who say yes or no. He who led on the young man is dead. It is cold, and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them, have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, perhaps freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." Unquote. Chief Joseph, 1877. Wounded Knee. The final episode in the so-called Indian Wars occurred in 1890 at the Massacre of Wounded Knee in South Dakota. On their reservation, the Sioux had begun to perform the ghost dance, which told of a Messiah who would deliver the tribe from its hardship, make the whites disappear, and return the world to the way it was before the arrival of the whites. Settlers began to worry that the ghost dance movement was foretelling an uprising, and the militia prepared to round up the Sioux. The tribe, after the death of Sitting Bull, who had been arrested, shot, and killed in 1890, prepared to surrender at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, on December 29, 1890. A detachment of the 7th Cavalry Regiment intercepted Spotted Elk's band of Minneconjou Lakota and 38 Hunkpapa Lakota and escorted them to Wounded Knee Creek, where they made camp. On the morning of December 29th, the cavalry troops went into the camp to disarm the Lakota. One version of events claims that during the process of disarming the Lakota, a deaf tribesman named Black Coyote was reluctant to give up his rifle, claiming he had paid a lot for it. Simultaneously, an old man was performing a ghost dance. Black Coyote's rifle went off at that point, and the army began shooting at the Native Americans. The disarmed Lakota warriors did their best to fight back. By the time the massacre was over, between 150 and 300 men, women, and children had been killed, and 51 wounded. 25 soldiers also died, and 39 were wounded. At least 20 soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor at the time, but the event has come to be regarded as a massacre on the part of the cavalry rather than a battle. It does, however, mark the last violent conflict on the Great Plains between government troops and Native Americans. Americanization. Through the years of the Indian Wars of the 1870s and early 1880s, opinion back east was mixed. There were many who felt, as General Philip Sheridan, appointed in 1867 to pacify the Plains Indians, allegedly said that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. But increasingly, several reformers, who would later form the backbone of the Progressive era, had begun to criticize the violence, arguing that the Native Americans should be helped through Americanization to become assimilated into American society. Individual land ownership, Christian worship, and education for children became the cornerstone of this new and final assault on Native American life and culture. Beginning in the 1880s, clergymen, government officials, and social workers all worked to assimilate natives into American life. The government permitted reformers to remove children from their homes and place them in boarding schools, such as the Carlisle Indian School or the Hampton Institute, where they were taught to abandon their tribal traditions and embrace the tools of American productivity, modesty, and sanctity through total immersion. Such schools not only acculturated Indian boys and girls, but also provided vocational training for males and domestic science classes for females. Adults were targeted by religious reformers, specifically evangelical Protestants, as well as a number of Catholics, who sought to convince Native Americans to abandon their language, clothing, and social customs for a white lifestyle. While the concerted effort to assimilate Native Americans into American culture was abandoned officially in the 1830s, integration of Native American tribes and individuals continues to the present day. Non-Native Americans often fail to see that assimilation was never completed. Since the 1960s, there have been major changes in American society in general, including a broader appreciation for the pluralistic nature of the United States and its many ethnic groups, as well as for the special status of Native American nations. More recent legislation to protect Native American religious practices, for instance, points to major changes in government policy. Some tribes have instituted a sort of reverse of the boarding schools of 100 years ago and initiated language immersion schools for children, where a native language is the medium of instruction. For example, the Cherokee Nation instigated a 10-year language preservation plan that involved growing new fluent speakers of the Cherokee language from childhood. The Cherokee Preservation Foundation has invested $3 million into opening schools, training teachers, and developing curricula for language education, as well as initiating community gatherings where the language can be actively used. Despite efforts to right the wrongs of the past, the nation's first residents remain its poorest and most oppressed. The United States is home to 3.1 million Native Americans, which accounts for only 0.9% of the entire population. While Native Americans have begun to take more control of their tribal economies, especially through the establishment of casinos, poverty on reservations is still a major issue. The census in both 1990 and 2000 found that the poverty rate of Native Americans is 25%, and unemployment rates are unusually high. For example, the unemployment rate on the Blackfoot Reservation in Montana was 69%, at a time when the national unemployment rate was 6.7%. According to the 2000 census, Native Americans living on reservations have incomes that are less than half of the general population. Alcoholism, mental illness, especially due to fetal alcohol syndrome, and teen suicide all remain problems on Americans' Native American reservations.
Conclusion. It is hard to look at the history of the Indian Wars and feel anything but shame and sadness for the destruction of lives, cultures, and ecology of the Native American West. Indeed, America's first citizens are perhaps the ones who lost the most during the course of its history. So perhaps the question is easy for us to answer from our perspective in the 21st century. Of course, the Indian Wars were a tragedy. But we as historians must remember to look at history through two lenses. Yes, we can view what happened through the perspective we are granted now and judge the past based on our own values. In this way, we can use the Indian Wars, the destruction of the bison, and Americanization as cautionary tales to illustrate messages we wish to tell. However, we must also consider the past from the perspective of all those who lived through it. Certainly for some, wasn't the outcome of the Indian Wars a triumph? Who were these people? Were they evil to have had ideas we judge to be so wrong? What do you think?